Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you. It's wonderful to see friendly names, at least if not faces, in the chat, and wonderful to meet the rest of you. And thank you for everyone who has gone before and laid the groundwork for thinking about story and applying story. It's been fantastic, and I've loved the new kind of, mind ideas I've been getting. It's been wonderful. I'm Mary Alice, and I'm a story activist, and that means I'm interested in how you find and create your compelling story, and I'm also interested in how you host it to life. So the word activist for me means paying attention to what you decide to activate, because the things that we pay attention to, of course, are the things that grow, the things that we see more of. So it's not enough just to find the story like David and Grace Ann were talking about. You have to know how to work with it. So how do you host it? And I think that's one of the key capacities of leadership, is that leaders need not only to be great storytellers, but they also need to be fantastic hosts. So I want to bring you two pieces of my kind of love affair with the world, which are storytelling and hosting. So first, a little bit of history. Wow, does that go back a bit? So bear with me if you're younger than me. But in 1983, John Nesbitt and Patricia Aberdeen wrote a book called Megatrends. And I don't remember the rest of the trends out of that book, but one has stuck with me ever since, and it was called High Tech, High Touch. Now, you might not think that those two things have anything to do with each other. Certainly in 1983, people went, what? But if we think back in the late 70s, that was the beginning of the rise of personal computers and also the storytelling revival. So in the UK and in the US, people started creating storytelling festivals and folks started going to them. So suddenly storytelling was coming into the world in a different way. In 1997, I happened to meet Patricia Aberdeen at a conference, and she was telling about her 10 major trends for the time, and one of them was leader as storyteller. And she gave me the page out of her speech, which I still have. And so I began to wait for the time when this would be true. In 2003, the first group that I knew about anyway gathered together in Washington, D.C., and Paul Costello, who's been on the chat here on other days, was part of that particular movement. And they called it the Golden Fleece. It was named after Jason and the Argonauts going after the Golden Fleece. That's the first time I heard about storytelling in organizations. At that time, very new. So, whenever anything gets to Harvard Business Review, it's mainstream. So suddenly here we are this many years later, and what has started then is coming true now. When I learned about storytelling at a storytelling festival, I went, wow, that's so fantastic. I wonder if I could do it. And I spent a long time in the library like this, and the 698.2 section, which is folk tales, fairy tales, myths, and legends. I told stories to groups and children and all those type of people. And then I decided, you know what? I think there needs to be more than my voice in the room. I'm much more interested in how do all voices get in. And that has been the focus of my work. I guess if you'd say what's at the heart of my work, it's this big invitation that says, please come back to the fire and bring your story with you, because all those stories are important. So Jeff Mead talked earlier in the week about using a tree as a metaphor, and that's something I do too. When people say to me, what is storytelling and how does it work? I say, just pretend you're part of a stand of trees. Trees are individuals, but they're also part of a collective. They don't grow by themselves. They usually grow together. And they share nutrients and information through the mycelium sheath. That's the mushroom kingdom. And so trees are always sharing. I'm looking out my window right now because there's one across the road. Trees are always sharing information and nutrients with each other. So a tree that's on the edge of a group of trees will warn the others when pests are coming or when weather is changing. So if you ask me, what is the mycelium sheath for human beings? I'd say it's story. Story wraps right around the world, gives us nutrients, information. And it's interesting what we decide to share through that mycelium sheath, because we were always sharing stories. So now is the time for the presentation piece, please. Let me see if I can I watched the other speakers going, where's the button? So let's see if I can do that. But if I can see the presentation, that would be great. So I want to put the focus on something that you all do all the time, and that's go into meetings. I don't know if you have noticed it, but meetings have continued even though there's been a pandemic. But the interesting thing about the pandemic is it's forced us online, and that means that things are amplified. That's what the digital world does for us. It amplifies things. So if you have a meeting, a power over structure in your meeting, in other words, only one person talks and everyone else is listening all the time, that's going to become even more apparent when you're online. But you could take advantage of those meetings you're going to have and do something with them. So now I'm going to see if I can do it well. Yeah, so leadership is really a lot about working hard to get things all lined up. But let me say that for me, the true test of leadership is what you do in challenging times. And the true test of story leadership is what you decide to do with your story. So David Hutchins, who you've heard earlier in the week, David Drake, who is a narrative coach, and I spent some time talking about what's the future of story. And we decided there are 3 waves of story. The first is story for influence. This is the wave we're in right now. That's why everybody wants to learn how to tell a story, because please look at me, I'm a good leader, or I know where we're going, or please buy my product, or this idea is a good one. So story for influence is really out there. We think the next wave is story for collective sense and meaning making. That's the kind of work I do. I could tell that's the kind of work that David and Grace Ann are doing. It's collective sense and meaning making, because when we collectively make sense and meaning, we bring wisdom to the entire field. It's like you raise all the boats. And the third piece is about healing and holing. And when I listened to Michelle, for example, earlier in the week, I could tell that her stuff, she started out with that core of story about healing. And so these are the waves we're in, and the speakers you've heard up until now have been really talking about all of those facets. So today there's 3 things I'd like you to learn with me. Number 1, a meeting unfolds like a story. Number 2, leadership is knowing where you are in the story. And number 3, you can change the impact of your meeting by hosting the story. So I want to start out in my meeting. Thanks for joining me at my meeting. So nice to have you here. I want to just start off with a little check-in and invite you, please, in the chat window to write to me. Where's the place that your feet are touching the ground? That sounds a bit strange, so let me say you might decide to answer that in many different ways, like my feet are under my desk on this fantastic looking carpet. My feet are on the ground in Columbus, Ohio. That's where I am. My feet are in the ground in a forest. My feet are on the intersection between I don't know where I'm going Avenue and I'm there Avenue. However you decide to answer that, where do your feet touch the ground? And secondly, what's your key insight been so far in the Storyfy Your Leadership Conference experience? So those 2 things. Would you please go into the chat window and just check in? The place where your feet touch the ground. And what's been your key insight from today or the rest of the conference so far? Let me see if you are there. I'm gonna. Okay. So Haritha is saying my feet are on the chair, folded. Thank you. Anybody else? Lauren, the diversity of presentations and the commonality of intent, I think that is. Listening, says Siegfried. Vilnius, hello to Vilnius, missing Vilnius myself. The inflection point, my daughter is in my daughter's bedroom. Yes, we're kind of camping out in different spaces, right? I'm in Costa Rica, yay. My feet are on the ground, listening mode, vulnerability, stories are meaning. Thank you. What we're doing right now is a check-in. And a check-in is a way to start a meeting so that everybody can be present and all voices can be heard. So let me just focus that bit. So during the time that we're together for these next moments, I want to invite you to put on 2 different hats while you're listening. The first one is the getting things done hat. Okay, how could I use this to really move my work on or my experience on? That's like the practitioner hat. How do I really build that? The second one here is about how do I put all these ingredients together? So a little bit of a cook, the cook in the kitchen, the major chef. How do I put all these ingredients I'm learning in ways that might be really helpful? So this is about getting things done and putting all the ingredients together. So let's talk about meetings. You wanted this maybe in your meeting? Yeah, we're on board, we're all on side. And how many times have you gotten this kind of thing? That's called crickets where I'm from. Nobody is meeting. Part of that is because you need to know what the shape of a meeting is. So what I want to share with you is a shape that comes out of the work of Sam Kainer, and he called it the diamond of participation, which was then enhanced by the art of hosting community, which I'm part of, art of hosting and harvesting conversations that matter. This is a practice community to how do you help people be in good meetings together and come to some resolution that is wiser action. This particular shape really helps to inform what a meeting does. So I want to tell you about the parts of this shape. I want to show you how story fits on that, and then I want to tell you a story about how that actually unfolded for me. So here are the different parts of how every meeting unfolds, regardless of whether it's an hour, 5 days, or whatever. The first part of it is called divergence. The second part is emergence, and the third part is convergence. So in the divergence place, people come in with, let's like question mark over their head. Who is here? How are we going to work together? What is this all about? What do I have to share? Who's going to listen to me? Am I safe here? All the things on Maslow's hierarchy come at this part of the meeting as you just step in. Even if you know the people really well, you're still wondering, how are they coming to this meeting? What are we going to do today? What will be the purpose and the outcome? So the question people have, like in the thought bubble over their head, are, what's this really about? Who's here? Who am I in this group? And what can we each offer? And there are people who love this phase. As I'm describing these, I'd like to invite you to figure out which part of this you really love, because that says something about how you lead, interestingly enough. So there's some people who love this phase of getting to know other people and hearing all the stories and getting all the diverse inputs. They love that stuff. But eventually you come to the edge of the known landscape, and then this happens. The old map from the medieval times that has that little thing on the side that says, here to be dragons. You've gone off the edge of the known universe, and things start to get foggy. It's uncomfortable. People don't know what to do. Sometimes people want to run screaming from the room. I thought we were the perfect group. Now I hate you, I hate myself, and I don't think we're ever going to make it. Oh my goodness. In the art of hosting world, we call this the groan zone. And this sounds particularly good in German. I speak German, and it's Knirschzone. That is the sound your teeth make when they crunch together. It's awful. But if you can stay here fruitfully enough in the not knowing, then eventually you'll get somewhere. So people are saying to themselves, hey, wait a minute, I want to do this, but everyone else is doing that. Uh-oh, can I really stay? And sometimes you can see that if people have their camera off or are multitasking, this is what's going through their head. They're not with you. But eventually, if you can stay there fruitfully, the sun comes out, innovation happens, and you move into convergence. And this is the getting things done piece, where you are asking, what do we need to do? How are we going to do it? And who's going to do it? And there are people saying to themselves, what's the plan? Who's responsible? What's my role? And now what? So did you locate the part of this that you actually like the most? There are some people I've worked with, like engineers, who say, I love convergence because I want to get something done. And they're just really annoyed or bored or angry in the other parts of this diagram because they're saying, can people just get on with it? Why are you talking so much? Why so many stories? So this is the outline of the shape of a meeting. I notice when I tell people this is the normal way that people go through meetings, there's a relief, especially when they get into the groan zone, because they go, oh, this is natural. It's naturally part of what needs to happen if we're going to invent something new. Otherwise, all you get's the same thing again and again. So this is helpful as a pattern. So let me add geography of story. Finding where you are in the story is really helpful because then you know what's going to happen. And of course, what's the story? A beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what we classically say, although many of our speakers have told all the things that are part of this. But beginning, middle, and end is classic, and let me apply that to this particular diagram. So what is the beginning about? And I want to just say a vote of thanks to Paul Costello, whose work this is based on, and who is really a master about talking about geography and story. So the beginning, what's the beginning of a story about? The beginning is all about creation. Something new is going to happen. This format of people may never have come together exactly like this before, and they may never meet again exactly like this. So there's something new that's starting. That's the beginning of any story, newness and creation. Then there's the middle of any story. What happens in the middle? Well, in the stories we love, there's confusion, there's complexity, there's chaos, there's lots of stuff happening. We love that kind of story when we read it. We don't like being in it so much. So you could call this actually the messy middle. There's going to be some mess before the sun comes out. And you know what? Sometimes it's really helpful to go, I raise my hand and declare it's a messy middle. There's some relief when you can do that. Just go, oh, confusion has happened. That means we're in the middle. That gives me a piece of interesting information. And the last part, of course, is the end, and that's about completion. We're going to come to completion in some form or another. So how do you deal well with each of those parts? Well, for the beginning, it helps to be really conscious. It helps to start clearly and know that you're in the beginning. That's why I asked you to check in. So in my world, check in and check out are two parts of meeting hygiene that keep this frame clean. Because, you know, people arrive to a meeting and they've been in 14 other meetings, and the stories of those meetings are kind of hanging out the back of their head. So their body arrives, but the rest of them doesn't. That's why sometimes 5 minutes in, you have people saying, what? Who are you? I didn't get it. I missed that piece. That's because they haven't totally arrived. That's why coming into a check-in is helpful. It helps you to let go what's been in the past and be present to what's going forward. And it gets all the voices in the room. It's a very easy piece of technology to do. Check out is the opposite one because it lets you close things easily. Okay, so being conscious about the beginning and stating, okay, we're starting. Here's what it's about. Here's who's here. Here's how we're going to be together. That's helpful. Instead of just, we all know why we're here, let's get on with it. I've been in those kind of meetings too. What do you do for the messy middle? It helps to be curious. And the best way you can do that is to have a good practice that helps keep you curious. The Buddhists talk about strong back, soft front. What is your practice? Do you meditate? Do you pet the dog? Do you go running? Do you exercise? What do you do so that you stay present instead of being triggered? And one of the best ways to stay present is to know your own story material. If you've been in meetings where you felt triggered, you know that something is pinged on your storyline and you should go after it rather than falling into reaction. The best thing a leader can do is be really clear about their own story material so that they can stay present in the story that's unfolding in front of them and not be triggered. That way you're most helpful. You haven't painted yourself into the corner. Let me point to one. There's one over there. You're in the middle of the room, able to move anywhere. And finally, this piece about conscious closure. We're very bad as human beings about making conscious closure. Often we just go, okay, bye, later. We don't ever go, let's close this up. What are you taking away with you? What are you doing? Let's be clear about where it goes from here so that we can make a finish. That's where we talk about meeting hygiene and cleaning off really well. So this is how a story fits underneath the pattern of this kind of a meeting. But you know, Jean-Luc Godard says, and I love this quote, a story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. This is in my new book. I love this kind of quote. So the interesting thing that Paul made me aware of is there's not only the beginning, the middle, and the end. There's the beginning of the beginning, the middle of the beginning, and the end of the beginning. There's the beginning of the middle of the middle, the end of the middle, and so on. So the challenging thing is that there are some stories ending, there are some stories beginning, and there are some stories in the messy middle at every point in time in the moment. So the biggest way we come into conflict when we're looking at story or meetings is that we believe everybody's in the same place in the story as we are, and they are not. So classically, if you've been on any kind of change project, you'll always have somebody say, those people are resistant to change, they're dragging the chain. Which makes it sound like a chain gang, which is pretty awful now that I think about it. But what's happening is they're in a different part of the story than you are. So most often change teams are way past hello, they're into let's party because it's happening. And the people they're working with aren't even in hello. They don't even know the story is changing. And then we blame them for not being part of it. So conflict comes in groups when we think we're all in the same part of the story and we are not. And conflict comes inside ourselves when we believe that all parts of our life are in the same part of the story and they are not. Because in your own life, there are going to be endings, beginnings, and messy middles all at the same time. I found this quote from Charles Eisenstein I thought was really lovely. To be fully in service of something one has experienced as real is the essence of leadership in a non-hierarchical age. A leader is the holder of a story, someone whose experience of its reality is deep enough so that she or he can hold the belief on behalf of others. So often when I'm hosting a group, and I've been a facilitator for 25 years, there'll be that point when we're in the messy middle, when we're in the middle of the story and confusion and chaos and complexity are running around the room having a great time. And I find people looking at me. And why are they looking at me? They're looking at me to see, does she believe we can make it? And my job is to believe wholeheartedly in the story, we can make it. So that what they see radiating off of me is the potential that I can see in that particular group. Even if there are moments. One time I had somebody say, I saw you looked in a certain direction, what was going on? And I said, I was praying for help. And it arrived, actually. I was asking for help. So it's kind of interesting to look at that. So this is to say that really story is the key component of your toolkit of all the other tools that you have there. Story is what holds it all together. Story is what helps it to happen. Story holds it all together. So let me just tell you a brief story about beginning, middle, and an end in that framework of what happened to me. 2015, this was a moment when I had to give everything away as a facilitator, as a storyteller. So I was invited to work with a group of Afghani civil servants, and I was invited by the German Organization for International Development. And normally they would invite people to Germany to do this kind of work, but they'd had too many people who came to Germany and decided not to go home. So they looked in a radius around Kabul and said, let's host the people in Asia, and they decided to host them in Bangkok. This is an interesting choice because many of the guys or almost all of the guys who were, and they were all men, because no woman would go to Bangkok because of Bangkok's image as a town where many things can happen and people go for certain interesting pursuits and tourism. So they were all men, and most of those men had never been outside of Afghanistan, and some of them had never even been to Kabul. So here we have a new group of men coming who are not internationally aware, and they were confronted, of course, with three of us who were hosting this particular gathering, and two of us were women. So it's the first time I've experienced being in a group where not only would people not sit next to me, but they also wouldn't look at me. So we knew the topic was story, but we also knew that that probably was not the request of the participants. So we called it leadership, and we decided to bring story in. So we started off, and there was a colleague from Belgium, Julie, and me, and then Mahmoud, who was from Germany. His family had been refugees to Germany at age 14, and he was the third member of our team. So things started out in a very interesting way when we realized that they had positioned us next to the swimming pool, and that they'd given us a translator who could translate from Farsi to German, and we were presenting the course in English. And it kind of went on from there. So we were probably about day two when we were asking, day two or day three when we were of a 7-day program, when we were asking them to do a story piece together as a trio. And we noticed in the room that there were many groups who were not doing the work. And so we went around to find out what was going on. And we saw the guys looking at their cell phones. That was the moment that war came into the room, because they were watching the footage of a bomber who had gone into a building and blown themselves up. And they were watching the footage from that event. And of course, that meant that suddenly we had another participant in the room we had not expected. And how do you work with people whose only experience is this, 35 years of war? And how can you say to them That's your reality, but that's not the only reality. And so we went through this very challenging time. It became more and more challenging till finally we came to the midpoint of the week when they were going to have a day off and go away, and we as a team were in fundamental breakdown. And I came to that point of saying, I don't know what to do. I said to myself, I want to go home. But I was an intentional nomad at that time. I actually didn't have any home base. I was living out of my suitcase, so I realized I was stuck where I was. And also we had pressure inside of the team. So Mahmoud kept saying, I want to see you shine. I want them to learn how wonderful Story is. And I just finally had to say to him, stop it. It's too much pressure. You can't put your expectations on me in this kind of a context. And I realized I have to give everything away. I have to give away that I'm a good facilitator. I have to give away that facilitation is a great thing to do. I have to give away that Story is healing or helpful. I have to give everything away. It was one of the toughest moments of my career when I looked at the other two and I said to them, you know what? I don't have to love these. I don't have to like these people. In fact, I don't like some of them very much. They feel to me manipulative and really not kind of like I didn't like them, but I have to love them enough. I have to love them enough so that we can do this well and come to a good resolution in what we're trying to do. And so in that moment of surrender, I found for myself and we found as a team, because we had this particular diagram to stand on and we had shown it to the guys and they thought it was amazing. So we had process and practice enough to stand on to go forward with each other. And one of the interesting points for me was a little story. I finally decided, how do I tell them about the power of story? And I decided to tell them a story to do that. So let me tell it to you very briefly. And just to say, this is a story I had seen perhaps 10 years earlier. I had no copy of it. I didn't remember the major name of the character, but I remembered the shape, and that was enough. And it was called The Golden City. And I started off by saying to them, once long ago, in the beautiful and fabled land of Aryan, because that was the traditional name of Afghanistan, Aryan, there was a fabled and well-known city. But the ruler of that city had died and left the responsibility to his son, and the city had begun to fall into ruins. The traders who came were abusing the people. The power mongers had taken the power. Everyone was suffering. And so this young new ruler decided to ask for help. And so first he went to the people of power, only they wanted more power. And then he went to the people who were in the streets and they only wanted to be saved. And then he went to the merchants and asked them to change their ways, only they didn't want to. And so finally he called out to many wise people and they all came and he held council. And then a very interesting thing started to happen. One of the mosques was set aside and there was a barrier put around it so no one could enter. But the people saw that workmen were beginning to go in and out of the building, in and out of the building. Something was happening in there and they became very, very curious. What's going on in there? And this went on for an entire month until finally there was an invitation given to the merchants who came through town. They were invited to come in, but only if they agreed never to speak of what they had seen. Well, they were all curious too, so they went in there and they looked and they came out and the people could see they were profoundly changed. Well, this made them even more curious. What's in there? And so they began to lobby the ruler. We want to see what is inside this building. And so finally he agreed, but he said, on the same condition. I will allow you to see what's in here as long as you never speak of it. And so the first people agreed and they went inside and the others could see when they came out, they were profoundly changed. And so they wanted to go in too, and they did. And so finally, everyone had seen what was there. No one spoke of it, but interestingly enough, the city regained its position as one of the fabled cities of the land. People looked after each other. They were kind and generous. The merchants were honest. The people in power shared their power. And then I looked at the leaders who had leaned in that story and I said, so would you like to know what was in the building behind the curtain? And of course they said yes. I said, I'll tell you as long as you promise never to tell anyone else. Inside of the curtain, behind the curtain inside of this building, the ruler had asked the workmen to build a golden representation of his dream for this city. And they did. And it was so beautiful and so compelling that everyone who saw it took it into their heart and began to make it true. And that, my friends, is the power of story and the power of leadership. And they went, I have to tell you the funny thing that happened out of that. In our closing round, we could see the impact we'd had on people. And inside of our team, we had had one person who was a police officer who told us, I can no longer do this role. I cannot do the violence in this role any longer. And in the end, the other police officer who was there was a very devout man, actually. And because you know the frame of this story and how much we had done over the 7 days, when he said this, I smiled. You take this out of context, it sounds very strange, but he said in the closing, I've realized how powerful story is. And now that we can no longer torture people, I think we could use story to figure out what's really happening. And I took that very in a heartfelt way because I knew how profoundly he had shifted during the time we were together. And this is a kind of a strong moment for me. And I only thought of that this morning. So Artum, I want to say I'm done with everything else I wanted to say. I have a little clip. We could show that if you think there's time. I have something to say about that. But let's come back together and turn off the slides. And thank you for listening. And Michelle, you've now heard the story. My TEDx talk, so she heard it there too.
Lovely. I remember hearing that story when you were in Russia. That was changed
yes.
for me too. So would you like to roll the clip?
I would actually. I think there's something important to say about it if we think it'll work. Okay. So, and if Yanis and Brigitte are in the room, they'll know this is my favorite clip too. The clip is the lighting of the beacon fires from Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. And I love this set of movies, and I've watched them, I cannot explain to you how many times, because I was living in New Zealand at the time when these movies were being made. So they belong to me, because I know people who were in them, I know people who worked on them, I know the story behind them, I've seen the sets. And I'm part of it somehow because New Zealand is a part of me. So this particular little clip for me gives really the experience of what it's like to lead an initiative over a long course of time that's been waiting a long time to happen. And there are many parts that you can see in this particular clip. So it starts out with Gandalf the wizard and one of the hobbits who is there in the White City. And the hobbit needs to climb up to the top and light the beacon fire. And he's the only one who can do it. So it doesn't happen to be the wise old elder who can do the job at the moment. It's the young thing that has to do this work. And there's that moment where finally he lights the beacon fire and he's really proud of himself, but then he suddenly realizes he's standing right in the middle of the fire and there's a uh-oh moment. Also during that time when the beacon fire gets lit and it's going off, you'll see the old guard, he's got a face really like this, so that the old guard is realizing, the old power is realizing that it has to step back. There's that moment. And Gandalf stands as the fire is starting to go out and says, you can't understand that in the clip very well, but he says, hope is kindled. The fire's lit, hope is kindled. And then the fire starts to be lit on and on and on. So I want to remind you, I used to work for the New Zealand Tourism Board, so I want to say the fires are CG, but the mountains are real. But you can imagine what it's like to be the person standing by a beacon fire who has to wait and wait and wait for the signal to do something, who has to perpetually be ready and waiting. How much loyalty and hope that needs to take, and how it's part of a leadership role to actually keep that hope alive before the fire is lit. So it goes on and on and on. Finally, Aragorn sees the fire. He goes running into the hall and shouts out, Gondor calls for aid. And then there's this moment of silence, a really almost too long moment of silence. Is the leadership going to respond to the call? And that's the moment many of us have when we're putting forward our brilliant ideas and we're hoping that they get picked up. And finally, the king says, and Rohan will answer. So I'm offering you this minute with many little elements in it to see what it takes to hold on to your view of leadership for long enough. Please enjoy the lighting of the beacon fires.
Let's all show Mary Alice how lit are our fires, because we can. You're muted, Mary Alice.
The beacon fires are lit.
Yay! Thank you so much for this amazing experience. I would love to ask you a lot of questions that are coming from the chat, but we are moving off to Paul Smith at the moment. I need to ask you one question though, and offer you to answer people in the chat if you're all right with that. So,
yes,
my question, you've heard it 1,000 times by now. What if a story came to life and was about to teach leaders one thing and one thing only? That one thing would be?
Please come back to the fire. Make the fire for your team, for your community, for your customers, and invite them to the fire, because we need those fires of community right now so that we can be a better humanity together, and leadership has a lot to do with it.
Need the fire to be a better humanity. Lovely. I'm just jotting it down.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.